On October 2nd, 1552, on a hill overlooking the Volga River, a city burned. Kazan, the capital of the last Mongol successor state, was collapsing. Inside its walls, 10,000 Tatar cavalry fought to the last breath. Outside, 150,000 Russian troops poured through breaches, blasted open by weapons the world had never seen. Watching it all unfold was a 22-year-old Ivan IV, later known as the Terrible. This isn't just a story of a battle. It's the story of how a small nation broke free from the shadow of the Mongols after 300 years and began its rise to becoming the largest country on earth. How did a young Tsar defeat a power that had dominated Russia for centuries? And how did one decision change history? To understand, we must go back to the 13th century. In 1237, Badu Khan's Mongol cavalry swept across the steppes like a storm. Russia wasn't merely conquered, it was crushed. Kiev, the heart of Slavic civilization, was leveled. For the next 240 years, Russian princes knelt before the Khans of the Golden Horde. Tribute flowed to Sarai. Permission was required even to rule one's own lands. Mongol horsemen could appear at any moment to raid, loot, or take slaves. By the 15th century, the Golden Horde fractured into 3 khanates: Crimea, Astrakhan, and Kazan. Of these, Kazan was the greatest threat to Moscow. Its fortress overlooked the Volga River, controlling trade and military movements. More importantly, it preserved Mongol military culture. Tatar cavalry remained the most feared warriors of the steppe. From 1438 to 1552, Russian forces attempted to take Kazan at least 10 times, and failed every time. Russian sieges faltered due to supply problems or Tatar raids on their lines. Kazan seemed invincible. Then came Ivan IV. In 1547, the 16-year-old declared himself Tsar, Caesar, Emperor of all Russia, not merely Grand Prince. Unlike his predecessors, Ivan was not content with symbolic victories. He had grown up in fear and isolation, watching boyars fight for power while neglecting and abusing him. He vowed never to let Russia be weak again. Kazan was the obstacle to that vision. Early campaigns in 1547 and 1549 to 1550 failed. But Ivan didn't give up. He studied the failures. The problem wasn't his soldiers' courage. It was logistics and technology. To conquer Kazan, he needed 3 things: a forward base near the city, modern siege weapons, and a professional, disciplined army. In 1551, a remarkable engineering feat began on the Volga. From the town of Uglich, thousands of numbered logs floated downstream. They weren't ordinary logs. They were parts of a prefabricated fortress designed by engineer Ivan Vyakov. When the pieces reached a point just 18 meters from Kazan, Russian troops reassembled them in weeks. They named it Svyazk. This fortress wasn't merely a technical marvel. It was strategic genius. For the first time, Russia had a solid base near Kazan, a place to store supplies, weapons, and troops. No longer would long supply lines limit their campaigns. With Svyazk established, Ivan focused on modernizing his army. He integrated artillery, trained infantry in coordinated maneuvers, and emphasized discipline. When the 1552 campaign began, the Russians were no longer relying solely on numbers or courage. They combined strategy, technology, and logistics. By October, the city was surrounded. Artillery pummeled the walls, undermining both the Tatar defenses and their morale. The Tatar cavalry, so feared for centuries, found themselves trapped on the hilltop. The Russians pressed forward, and breaches widened under cannon fire. Tatar warriors fought bravely, but without room to maneuver and facing unprecedented weaponry. Their resistance collapsed. Ivan IV watched as the city fell. Kazan, the last stronghold of Mongol power in Russia, burned. For the first time in 3 centuries, the shadow of the Golden Horde was broken. Russia had taken a decisive step toward becoming a centralized, expansive state. The victory at Kazan wasn't just military, it was symbolic. It marked the end of Mongol dominance in Russia, demonstrated the power of disciplined strategy over sheer cavalry mobility, and set the stage for Russia's transformation into a major Eurasian power. One young Tsar, using innovation, preparation, and patience, had achieved what generations before him could not. But Ivan didn't stop there. He knew traditional Russian forces. Feudal cavalry, where nobles brought their own men, lacked discipline and coordination. So he created something new, the Streltsy, Russia's first standing army of professional musketeers. Paid, trained, and loyal to the Tsar rather than local nobles, they were equipped with arquebus, the most advanced firearms of the era. Artillery was another game changer. Ivan hired experts from Italy and Germany and assembled 150 cannons, a massive force of the time. But the decisive figure was an English engineer called Butler, known to the Russians as Rosmul, the Wise One. He specialized in mining tunnels and using gunpowder to destroy walls. By June 1552, everything was ready. Ivan didn't just have a larger army. He had a smarter, better-equipped one. On June 16th, he led 150,000 troops toward Kazan, his 11th attempt. By August 22nd, Russian forces arrived below Kazan's walls. The defenders weren't intimidated. They had repelled the Russians 10 times before. Kazan sat atop a high hill with thick wooden walls and a deep moat. Inside, supplies lasted months, and 10,000 elite Tatar cavalry defended it. Khan Yadigar Muhammad even sent Ivan a message. "Everything is ready. We invite you to the feast." Instead of a direct assault, Ivan began digging zigzag trenches, approaches, a European siege tactic never before seen in Russia. Meanwhile, Ivan Verkov built a 12-meter-high battery tower, a multi-tiered structure designed to hold 10 heavy cannons on top and 50 lighter guns below. The idea: concentrate firepower on a single wall section. It was the ancestor of modern artillery fortifications. Construction was hidden behind temporary walls to prevent Kazan's cannons from destroying it. Meanwhile, Russian artillery had one mission: silence the city's guns. By August 29th, after a week of bombardment, they succeeded. Kazan's heavy cannons fell silent, and the tower was moved into position. Then nature intervened. Torrential rains turned the Russian camp into a muddy swamp. Tents blew away, morale plummeted, and some soldiers feared Tatar sorcery. Chronicles mention magicians on the walls performing rituals, while Russian priests blessed the camp with relics from Jerusalem. Whether by coincidence or faith, the weather cleared. Underground, another battle was unfolding. Mining teams dug tunnels toward Kazan's secret water supply. On August 30th, a massive explosion destroyed it. Now, every drop of water had to be rationed. The battery tower began pounding the same section of wall with 60 cannons. Inside the city, conditions grew desperate. Food dwindled, water was gone, and the walls were under relentless artillery fire. Khan Yadigar still refused to surrender. Even when Ivan sent captured Tatars back with peace offers, the defenders executed them rather than yield. But Ivan had yet to use his decisive weapon, the mines beneath the walls. Tunnels were expanded into large chambers, filled with tons of gunpowder, and connected with intricate fuses to create a cascade of explosions. On the morning of October 2nd, 1552, Ivan gave the order. Thunderous detonations ripped through Kazan's defenses. A section of wall near the Arc Gate was blown into the air, opening the city to Russian forces. The combination of professional troops, modern artillery, engineering ingenuity, and patience had done what 10 previous campaigns could not. Kazan, the last bastion of Mongol power in Russia, fell. Ivan IV had broken the centuries-old yoke of the Golden Horde. For Russia, it marked the beginning of a centralized state capable of projecting power across the steppe. One young Tsar had achieved what generations before him could not. Then another explosion near the Neugate. Then another. When the dust settled, there were 3 massive breaches in Kazan's walls, and 150,000 Russian troops began their advance. What happened next was one of the most brutal urban battles of the 16th century. Russian forces poured through the breaches like a flood. But Kazan's defenders didn't run. They fought in every street, every house, every alley. This was the last desperate stand of a culture seeing its end. Tatar cavalry, fearsome warriors on the open steppe, were now trapped in narrow city streets. They couldn't use their speed and mobility, but still they fought. Civilians, men, women, even children, grabbed whatever they could find and joined the fight. They threw stones from rooftops. They poured boiling oil from windows. They knew that if the city fell, everything they knew would end. They were right. The Streltsy, Ivan's trained musketeers advanced through each district with deadly discipline. They shot defenders from a distance, where traditional Tatar close combat skills were less effective. In Kazan's main mosque, a religious leader named Kol Sharif and the students made a final stand. They turned the madrasa, the Islamic school, into a makeshift fortress and fought to the last man. Kol Sharif died defending his sacred library. By the afternoon of October 2nd, Khan Yadigar Muhammad was captured. Soon after, the leading Nogai generals also surrendered. Some survivors tried to flee to the northern forest but were hunted down and killed. Others retreated into the inner citadel, but there was no hope. By sunset, Kazan had fallen. What happened next was brutal, even by 16th century standards. Most Tatar buildings were destroyed. Mosques were burned. But there were also moments of humanity. Between 60,000 and 100,000 Russian prisoners and slaves, people captured in raids over many years, were freed. Many had been held for decades. Some had forgotten how to speak Russian. Ivan wasn't present in the street fighting. According to historical records, he remained in his tent, praying throughout the battle. Some historians see this as wisdom. The Tsar shouldn't risk his life in chaotic combat. Others suggest Ivan was afraid. But what mattered most wasn't where Ivan was, but what he had achieved. After 42 days of siege, after 114 years of existence, after centuries as a center of Mongol-Tatar power on the Volga River, Kazan had fallen. On October 4th, Ivan entered the conquered city. He ordered an Orthodox church built on the ashes of the main mosque and decreed that a new symbol would be placed on Russian churches, a cross standing atop an Islamic crescent. The message was clear. The last Mongol Empire had been defeated, but the story didn't end there. In fact, it was just beginning. The fall of Kazan wasn't just a military victory. It was a turning point in world history. One of those moments where you can say, before and after this event, the world was different. The victory at Kazan proved something crucial. European military technology, cannons, siege engineering, professional armies, was superior to traditional steppe warfare. For centuries, Mongol-Tatar cavalry had dominated battlefields with speed, mobility, and mounted archery tactics. But against fortified walls, against cannons and firearms, that advantage disappeared. This is why, after Kazan, the other Khanates quickly fell. In 1556, Astrakhan was conquered. A few decades later, Sibir, the last Khanate, also collapsed. The age of steppe empires was over. With Kazan and later Astrakhan under Russian control, the entire Volga River, from source to mouth, was now Russian. This was the most important trade route in Eastern Europe, and Moscow controlled it. This opened trade with Persia via the Caspian Sea, opened routes to Central Asia, and most importantly, it opened a path to Siberia. Just 3 decades after Kazan fell, Russian fur trappers began crossing the Urals. By 1639, less than a century after Kazan, Russians had reached the Pacific Ocean. They had crossed the entire Asian continent in the time it took other European nations to explore a single coastline. This is why Russia today is the largest country in the world by area. It all began with the conquest of Kazan. Perhaps the most profound consequence was about identity. For 300 years, Russia had been dominated by Mongol-Tatar Muslim powers. Moscow's grand princes had to kneel before the Khan, pay tribute, and ask permission to rule their own lands. With Kazan's conquest, that relationship reversed. For the first time, Moscow was no longer subordinate. For the first time, Russians became the conquerors. And for the first time, the Russian state became a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire. Kazan brought dozens of peoples: Tatars, Chuvash, Mari, Udmurt, Bashkir. Some were Muslim. Some followed ancestral religions. Now they all lived under Russian rule. Moscow's rule. This is why some historians argue that October 2nd, 1552, was the birth date of the multicultural Russian Empire we know today. But there was also a dark side. Kazan's Muslim population was expelled from the city. Mosques were destroyed. A campaign of forced conversion began, though it wasn't entirely successful. And for the Tatars, this wasn't a glorious triumph of civilization over barbarism. This was the end of their independent state, the beginning of centuries living under foreign rule. Even today, on October 15th, October 2nd in the old calendar. Some Tatars in Tatarstan mark the day of remembrance and sorrow, commemorating those who died defending Kazan. The Russian government banned public rallies on this day in 2021, but the memory persists. History, as always, is complex. One person's victory is another's tragedy. Ivan returned to Moscow in glory. News that his wife had given birth to a son added to the joy. Though the boy didn't live long, he was welcomed as a hero. To commemorate his victory, Ivan built one of the most famous buildings in Russian history, St. Basil's Cathedral on Red Square in Moscow. With its colorful, oddly shaped domes, the cathedral was a fusion of Russian architecture and Eastern elements, a physical symbol of the new multicultural empire Russia had become. The building was more than a church. It was a statement. Russia was now a power capable of absorbing other cultures and territories while projecting its own identity. But Ivan's story doesn't have a happy ending. In the years after Kazan, Ivan became increasingly brutal and mentally unstable. He created the Oprichnina, a secret police force that terrorized the country. He killed thousands in fits of paranoid rage. In a moment of fury in 1581, he murdered his own eldest son with a staff, plunging Russia into a succession crisis. That is why we call him the Terrible, not just for his power, but for his cruelty. Yet, the lessons of Kazan remain distinct from Ivan's later tyranny. They are lessons in preparation, innovation, and the transformative power of decisive leadership. So, what are those lessons? I think there are three key takeaways. First, for centuries, military advantage belonged to those with the fastest cavalry, the best archers, and the most mobile armies. The Mongols built the largest contiguous empire in history based on those principles. But when technology changed, when cannons, firearms, and modern siege engineering appeared, the entire equation shifted. What was once invincible suddenly became vulnerable. This isn't just true in warfare. It's true in business, technology, and life. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. The ability to adapt, learn, and apply new ideas determined survival. Ivan wasn't the most naturally gifted general. He was willing to learn from failure, adopt new technology, and change methods. That's why he succeeded where others had failed repeatedly. Legends tell us of brave warriors and glorious battles. But the reality is that most battles are decided by boring things: logistics, supply lines, preparation, and meticulous planning. Ivan won at Kazan not just because he had a bigger army, but because he solved the supply problem with the construction of Sviazk, a forward base that allowed him to sustain a long siege. He trained soldiers into disciplined units, gathered advanced artillery, and carefully coordinated every detail of the assault. Second, the story of Kazan shows the human element of warfare. The defenders fought with extraordinary courage, even knowing the odds were stacked against them. Tatar cavalry, masters of open-step mobility, were trapped in narrow city streets but refused to surrender. Civilians joined in defense, men, women, and even children, throwing stones, boiling oil, and resisting occupation to the very last breath. Religious leaders like Kol Shuri fought and died defending not just their city, but their cultural identity. Their heroism reminds us that history is not just a story of rulers and empires. It's a story of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Third, Kazan demonstrates the long-term consequences of conquest. For Moscow, the fall of Kazan was the beginning of Russia's transformation into a centralized, powerful state. It was a first step toward controlling the entire Volga River, a vital trade and strategic corridor. It opened trade with Persia via the Caspian Sea, allowed access to Central Asia, and ultimately paved the way for the Russian expansion into Siberia. By 1639, Russians had reached the Pacific Ocean. They had crossed an entire continent in less than a century, establishing the largest territorial empire in world history. For the Tatars, however, it was a devastating loss. They became subjects in their own homeland, enduring centuries of foreign rule, cultural suppression, and forced assimilation. History is rarely black and white. For every victory, there is a tragedy. Kazan also teaches lessons about the evolution of military strategy. Steppe cavalry and archery tactics, dominant for centuries, were no longer sufficient against well-fortified cities and disciplined gunpowder armies. The Russian streltsy, trained in modern firearms, combined with engineers who built artillery towers and tunneling teams, demonstrated how innovation could overcome traditional advantages. Technology, planning, and logistics were decisive, more so than sheer numbers or raw courage. The psychological aspect of Kazan's siege is worth noting as well. For the Tatar defenders, centuries of Mongol dominance had created a culture of martial pride. They were fearless in open battle. But the siege demonstrated how entrenched fortifications and modern warfare could neutralize even the most elite warriors. Morale, supply, and ingenuity became more decisive than skill with the bow or horse. Ivan's leadership exploited these realities perfectly. Yet, the conquest of Kazan also reminds us that empires are built at a cost. Cultural destruction, forced conversion, and massacres accompanied every victory. Mosques were torn down, libraries destroyed, and centuries of Tatar governance erased. At the same time, captives and slaves who had been held for decades were freed, creating a complex legacy of both tragedy and liberation. Real history is never simple. It contains contradictions, heroes and villains, and unintended consequences. Finally, Kazan's fall teaches a broader lesson about timing, decisiveness, and adaptability. Ivan IV faced repeated failures before succeeding. He observed previous mistakes, studied technology, and reorganized his forces. He didn't rely on luck or brute force. He planned meticulously, experimented with engineering, and coordinated his army in ways never before seen on the Russian steppe. In life, whether in leadership, business, or personal endeavors, success rarely comes from one dramatic moment. It comes from preparation, persistence, and the willingness to change methods in response to new challenges. On October 2nd, 1552, on a hill overlooking the Volga River, a city fell, and with it, the last legacy of the Mongol Empire in Europe ended. But what rose from those ashes was something entirely new, a Russia that was expanding, multicultural, and increasingly powerful. The story of Kazan reminds us that history is made in defining moments, when leaders face impossible choices, when technology changes the playing field, and when empires rise and fall. It also reminds us that such moments have a cost. For every victory, there is a tragedy. For every beginning, an ending. Now, consider this. What struck you most about this story? Was it Ivan's innovative engineering and military planning, the courage of Kazan's defenders, or the long-term consequences that shaped the modern world? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future history stories. Because history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here, why decisions matter, and perhaps where we're headed next. Every great empire begins with a choice, a moment of courage, or a desperate decision when everything changes. Kazan is a story of all three, and its lessons still resonate today.